Okay, I think we can get going here. So I want to say hi to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Democracy Dialogues. I'm your host, Victoria Cuquetz. For those of you who have participated in past sessions, welcome back. It's great to see you. And for anyone newly joining us, thanks for being here. John Beebe, Ashley Denny Petch, and I have programmed an exciting discussion that we believe is timely, responsive, and engages those who are advancing democracy at all levels in Canada. And if you have an interesting idea or topic in mind that you'd like to share, I invite you to write to us, and we'd love to hear about it. So as I mentioned, I'm really excited to be here and be hosting this conversation. I'm hoping you'll all actively participate, and we look forward to your questions and comments in our chat box. But in the meantime, I'd love to have you introduce yourselves to me and to one another. So if you can use the chat function, please share your names and which organizations you're joining from today. So the episode today is going to look at, are political parties good for democracy? And we're going to take a deep look at their inner workings and some issues around diversity. We're going to explore the nomination process in the context of diverse candidate pools. And we have some pretty amazing and brilliant guests to help us do just that. But before we get into it, I'd like to do a bit of a poll question so we can see at what levels our audience here has engaged before. So Ashley's going to put up a poll in a second. So just wondering, how many of you have participated in a nomination process? So the poll's up now, so I'd love to see your answers, if people are able to access them. Okay, we're seeing some answers come in. So it's looking pretty split, 50-50. That's pretty cool. And then the second question we had was, are you a card-carrying member of a Canadian political party? So that's a little bit less even, but seeing some pretty interesting representation there. We have yes saying 11%, no 33%, and I used to be at 56%. So we have a pretty highly engaged audience here, but that's really no surprise to me. So we're going to get into the conversation in a moment, but first I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. So today we're meeting virtually. So you may not be on the same ground as me. I'm currently in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississauga's the New Credit Territory. So instead, please join me in acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today and to reflect on the importance of those lands. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and to collaborating in the spirit of reconciliation. And I know I've shared this with you before, but I think it's important to share again that I myself am a first-generation Canadian. My parents come from Australia, which is another white settler colony, and the formerly colonized India and Trinidad and Tobago. So my own commitment to a more equitable future is deeply felt and in solidarity with respect to my own maternal ancestors having been indentured laborers. So to continue my learning and put my observances into action, I've been engaging in OCAP training, which teaches First Nation principles of data governance. And so I highly encourage the rest of you to check out the course and potentially to engage in it yourselves. If you have events or learnings that you're taking part in to deepen your knowledge and solidarity with Indigenous people in Canada, then please share them in the chat so we can all learn. So thank you for that. So now I'd like to welcome our guests, Dr. Erin Tolley, a professor at Carleton University, and Dr. Quinn Albaugh, a professor from Queen's University, who have led research and published in this area. So a warm welcome to our guests today. Hi, Quinn. Hi, Erin. How are you?
Good, thanks. It's nice to be here.
Good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much. So let's get into the conversation a little bit. So why do we care about inclusive candidate pools? And what is the connection to democracy? And that's a bit of an open question for you both. Erin, did you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. It's a really good question. I think it's sort of like the guiding question. I think you want to think about it in a couple of ways. One is a big question around democratic equality. And so nomination processes are a very sort of initial entry point into political representation. For most candidates, this is the way that they will get into a legislature, into the House of Commons or to a provincial assembly. And so it's kind of like first stepping stone or stumbling block, to be honest. And if those nomination processes are conducted in a way that certain people are excluded or not included if they're conducted in a way that are not transparent, or where the outcomes are not equitable, that can really interfere with the overall composition of legislatures. And for me, my normative perspective is that legislatures should look like the populations that they represent in some way, that there should be a sort of rough correspondence between the population out there and the population that is inside of the legislature. So that's sort of the starting point that I begin at, and that's often called descriptive representation. And so this descriptive representation is really premised on what happens in nomination contests, and if they aren't conducted in a way to sort of contribute to a more representative or more diverse or more inclusive elected body, then there's a problem. There's a democratic problem there.
Thanks, Erin. And I think there's, a number of things that I want to press on there a little bit more, but I'm going to turn over to Quinn and have Quinn weigh in as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I would first start by saying that I agree with much of what Dr. Tolley already said, but I think like what I would add to that is that equality is a fundamental democratic value, and the persistent underrepresentation of like many groups within Canadian society, including like Black people, Indigenous people, many racialized communities, women, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, like their underrepresentation in elected office means that we haven't reached equality yet. Like it's degrading for people to look at politics and not see themselves in it. And so I think sometimes we talk about this in relatively like abstract or technical ways, but like to me, this is a very like concrete, personal like feeling for many people looking at Canadian politics. I don't want that to get lost, even though I think that like I agree with many of the arguments that Dr. Tolley makes about descriptive representation.
Yeah, and I think, just saying it really plainly like that really helps it just kind of distill very nicely. I think, as we've talked about before in Democracy Dialogues, representation matters. And if people don't see themselves in represented office, then they don't really necessarily conceive of seeing themselves there one day. And then they ultimately both question and not question kind of what's happening in a seemingly natural way. Though we know that principles of inclusive design, equity and diversity inclusion can all be built and very consciously done. So I think we're seeing a bit of a real world example happening in the news that I'd like to ask you both about as well. So there was a recent news story last week about Kevin Yard, who was Brampton North's first Black MPP, losing the nomination race to run again in this election. So I just wanted to ask you, what happened here in your opinion, and what do you think were some of the contributing factors? Erin, did you want to go first?
Maybe Quinn, you go first and I'll tie up at the end.
Okay. I mean, so like, as I understand it, what happened was that like the NDP, the Ontario NDP, unlike some other provincial political parties like the Liberals and the PCs, has a policy of allowing incumbents to be challenged for their nominations. And there are various ways that like party leaders and party organizations can protect incumbents from nomination challenges. Sometimes that's through like formal rules saying incumbents can't be challenged, or they can't be challenged if they meet certain like benchmarks. But there are also like informal things you can do as well. Like discouraging someone from challenging a sitting incumbent, or like trying to make it a bit easier for the incumbent to win, which is something I'll like be talking about, I'm sure, later in our chats. And so the Ontario NDP appears not to have done very much to support a Black incumbent seeking re-election. And like, given that like Black representation is important, like it's like hard to defend not doing anything to protect the incumbent if you care about Black representation. But at the same time, like Canadian parties are often trying to be internally democratic. So it's like, I think this is it's an interesting case to look at for sure.
Thanks, Quinn. Erin?
Yeah, that's really the point I wanted to pick up on. It is, to me, it raises a really important question about when parties choose to intervene. So it is true when you look at the formal rules of the Ontario New Democratic Party that, you know, there is a provision, there's no provision that says an incumbent must be protected. That is part of the party's rules, that, you know, incumbents could face, you know, a nomination challenge. And some would argue that that makes the party more democratic, that sort of nobody is above a nomination challenge, that everyone is sort of treated the same. I think the flip side of that argument, though, is to ask when parties choose to intervene or not. So while it is true that, you know, any incumbent can face a nomination challenge, it's quite revealing that this is the incumbent that faces the nomination challenge, because, you know, there are examples, you know, from Quinn's research and elsewhere of times when parties have chosen to intervene to protect the incumbent, either in explicit or more implicit and indirect ways. And that didn't happen in this case. And that's really quite revealing about who benefits from these types of processes or from this kind of behind the scenes work. So that's the big question that this case raises.
Thanks, Erin. So I guess my follow-up to that is, do you find, you know, these processes, so it sounds like what I'm hearing is, you know, there are times when people intervene, there are times when those who hold power does it to different ends. So I'm just wondering if we can just peel back a little bit. Who controls these processes? Who's intervening? If I can press on that a little bit more for our audience. And do you find the nomination process as it exists now democratic and transparent? I'm sure it's, you know, there's nuances across the parties, but just wondering if we can go there a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the nomination process has been called by various names. One is the black box of politics. The other is the secret garden of politics. I think these metaphors sort of help to answer that question about transparency and openness. They are a bit sort of, yeah, this a bit of an opaque process. They vary by party and are structured in different ways in federal and provincial parties and across the different party organizations. So it's difficult for an outsider to really have a good overview of what's happening in these processes. It's also the case that nominations are happening in all of the electoral districts all around the country. So in a federal election, there are 338 ridings. There are parties running nomination contests and these are all kind of mini elections taking place. So it's really hard to know when they're all happening and what's going on. So I think there is a question about transparency. In terms of who controls, they are governed at the party level. So parties, you know, have their own structures and they are able to structure the nomination as they choose. And so that's also a kind of separate kind of question. They all have constitutions and rules and guidelines, but what actually happens when those are put into practice?
Thanks, Erin. Quinn, I'd love to ask you the same thing, but I'd also like to add on to it. If you can maybe speak to a little bit, what happens when candidates choose to run as an independent?
Oh, okay. Well, I think I may start with the choosing to run as an independent part first, because I think it actually underscores why it's important that we pay attention to what's going on in parties and particularly how democratic parties are. It's like relatively easy to run as an independent on paper. Like, for example, if you want to run in the Ontario election this June, you need to be 18 or older, a citizen of Canada, a resident of Ontario for at least 6 months, and get 25 people in the riding where you want to run to sign your nomination papers. But if you run as an independent, you don't have good chances of winning. Like, independents generally don't win. And the ones who do tend to be people who previously won an election running for some party. usually one of the major parties. And so that's why it's so important to pay attention to how democratic parties are and what parties are doing to improve the representation of marginalized groups. But I think like I guess like focusing on whether like Canadian parties are democratic, you know, I think a lot of Canadians think that like if they are thinking about the nominations process at all, which many of them don't, that like they would be democratic because, you know, Canada is a democratic country. And the way nominations are supposed to work is by letting party or members of supporters in each riding vote for who they want to represent the party, like at a meeting or convention held by the party. But like, I think we should apply the same standards of democracy to political parties that we apply to countries. So this would be something like, are elections free and fair? Are there like checks and balances to make sure leaders can't abuse their power? And by these kinds of standards, Canadian parties are at best like flawed democracies. Like federal and provincial parties routinely allow party leaders and or party headquarters to schedule nomination votes at times that benefit the center's preferred candidate. They can, for example, like schedule a nomination 18 or 20 or even more months before the election when most people aren't paying attention, so that their preferred candidate can win the nomination without opposition. They can also call a nomination on short notice to make it harder for someone to challenge their preferred candidate. Like nomination meetings or nominating conventions are all about getting bums in seats. Mm-hmm. It's harder to do that when you only have like, say, 3 weeks to get organized. And so it's hard to have like fully free and fair elections when like parties can use these types of practices to put their hands on the scales.
Thanks, Quinn. And so I think, you know, my next question, I'd love to hear an example because I think it'd be difficult to spend our time inventorying all of them. But I'm just wondering, you know, what have some of the parties publicly stated or pledged when it comes to candidate diversity? And, you know, does planning and strategy necessarily result in a good outcome?
Oh, okay. So like as like part of my research for my book project, which is entitled Gatekeeping, How and Why Party Organizations Improve the Representation of Marginalized Groups, doing the sort of like mandatory self-promotion. I like spent about 20 months in New Brunswick studying the nominations process across political parties, like before and after the 2018 provincial election. And so in that election, the Galand Liberals set a target of nominating 50% women in seats not held by Liberal incumbents. And they were successful in meeting that target, in part by using some of these, like maybe not fully democratic, like what I would call gatekeeping practices, to help like the center's preferred women candidates win nominations or go through nominations without facing challenges. So like parties can hit targets that like they can set targets and meet them when they want to and are willing to put in the organizational effort. In that case, this did happen despite some resistance from within local riding associations and like various other actors in the party that weren't as supportive of the Premier Galant's target of nominating 50% women in seats not held by Liberal incumbents.
Thanks, Quinn. Yeah, and I enjoyed reading your article and learning a little bit more about what you refer to as affirmative gatekeeping. I think that you've given a really good example of it here, but I'm also just wondering if you can unpack the term a little bit for our viewers too, who might be hearing it for the first time.
Yeah, so I guess I think it's like worth talking about like what I think gatekeeping is, because yes. I think that's the, so like I take gatekeeping as like the use of like institutional practices, like the scheduling of nomination races at times to benefit preferred candidates. There are other ones like yeah, so using these institutional practices to influence the outcomes of nomination races, and like both like riding associations, but also party leaders and their staff, party headquarters, like all these actors have some ways of engaging in gatekeeping. But like over the past 50 or so years, like the like party leaders and their staff and party headquarters have increasingly gained control. And they've gained more gatekeeping practices to use to influence candidate selection. And like when we talk about affirmative gatekeeping, like I take this as a sort of a self-conscious intentional practice of using these sort of well-established gatekeeping practices to try to get members of a marginalized group nominated. I developed the concept by looking at like attempts to get women nominated in New Brunswick, but I think in principle, this idea could apply to other groups besides women. And like it's an attempt to, it's kind of like a, like an affirmative action, but taking place through like these sort of pre-existing gatekeeping practices. And I wouldn't say that it's always, like usually when I talk about this, people think, oh, affirmative gatekeeping is like so great. You know, it like it's getting like more people into elected office who weren't there before. But like, I mean, it's doing it through like practices that like many Canadians would find somewhat, you know, questionable. So I think that's something we should like maybe get into.
That's an interesting comment for sure, because I think when many of us hear the word gatekeeping, we kind of all tense up a little bit because it's been something that we've kind of problematized and talked about, you know, the negative sides of it in the past. You know, it's nice to hear when power can be instrumentalized for good, but I also think, you know, that binary isn't necessarily so stark, right? So Erin, I'd love to ask you a little bit about this as well. So, you know, from your perspective and research, what have parties been doing to create, you know, candidate pools that are more, to your point earlier, more representative of our nation's people? Do you think it's possible for politics to mirror Canada in a room or in a parliament?
So yes, I think it's possible for there to be a better representation. I mean, I think it's a really important question about what parties are doing, and I think this conversation around gatekeeping is really crucial. You know, one of the things that I found in my own research is that, which looks mostly at the federal level, is that, you know, parties differ in their approaches to candidate diversity. They have different sort of philosophical ways of thinking about candidate diversity, from the New Democratic Party, which has tended to be, you know, more proactive or interventionist or more explicit in their goals. That party sets an explicit target, which has shifted a bit, but generally speaking, they will say that, you know, 40% of their candidates will come from what they term equity-seeking groups, which includes women, racialized Canadians, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, the LGBTQ community, and youth. So they put all of those groups together, and they say that, you know, 40% of their candidate slate will come from these equity-seeking groups. In the most recent election, they set an additional target related to replacing retiring incumbents with candidates from these equity-seeking groups. So when a sitting member of parliament says they will not run again, they will take a proactive strategy to ensure that this candidate, that the replacement candidate comes from an equity-seeking group. You know, the Conservative Party has more of a free market philosophy. You know, may the best person win. They say they encourage, you know, all types of candidates to run, but they don't do a lot in terms of intervening to to sort of make that happen. The Liberal Party, you know, kind of unsurprisingly, has more of a kind of middle ground approach. They don't typically set an explicit target, which is quite in contrast to their explicit target of a gender parity cabinet, which they have explicitly committed to. But when it comes to the candidate slate, they haven't done that. Instead, you know, they've ran a campaign, for example, called Ask Her, which encouraged Canadians and party members to sort of recommend women who they could approach to run. That, in theory, is a good idea. It gets at one of the big barriers to candidacy, which is people not envisioning themselves as candidates, because when they look at the world out there, they don't see themselves as candidates. And so there's something to be said about that encouraging mechanism. But the result of that particular initiative suggests that hasn't gone far enough. That really isn't sufficient. It's sort of a good idea in theory, but it hasn't maybe panned out. I think one thing that's really important to mention about the NDP strategy that I think will surprise a lot of people is that for a number of years for which we have data on candidate diversity, the NDP historically did quite well nominated women candidates. They often were a leader when it came to the proportion of their candidate slates who were women. But when you look at the proportion of their candidate slate that is racialized, they were actually a laggard for many elections, sometimes being worse than the Conservatives or not any better, which tells you that these kinds of strategies, it's not one size fits all. So some measures may work to get women into politics, but not work when it comes to, other identity or other typically underrepresented groups. The NDP's record on racialized candidacies changed with the selection of Jagmeet Singh as leader, and I think that's quite significant. I think it set a tone that candidate diversity was important. It provided people with a role model in the party, and it also broadened the party's network. You know, now they didn't just say, well, we'd like more diverse candidates. They actually knew people. They knew people that they could ask and involve. And so I think that's a really important point. A lot of the sort of affirmative gatekeeping measures that Quinn talks about, at the federal level, they have successfully helped white women primarily come to office. They haven't been as successful with other groups. When you look at things around acclamation or nomination timing, racialized candidates have tended not to benefit as much from those types of measures as their white counterparts.
So Erin, thanks so much for that. And I think that's a perfect segue. Sorry, so I'd love to talk a little bit more about, so when we're building with equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility in mind, it's not just that you build in mind, it's also like those who are building it should be representative of those groups and actually, co-design and co-build. So, my first question is, from your research, how many of the people who actually hold power in nomination processes, whether they be party presidents or whomever is actually, baking the pie, so to speak, are actually representative of diverse groups? And yeah, so for both of you, I'd love to hear your take on that.
You want to start, Quinn, or I talked a lot, so maybe you take a turn.
Yeah, I mean, I would say generally in my experience, the people in various positions that have influence over nominations tend to be, usually older, straight white men, among other things that, So part of what ends up happening is that, so for example, with the Gallant Liberals and affirmative gatekeeping, what ended up happening was that it was, a group of primarily men in the premier's office who were designing a strategy to try to get, find women and get women nominated. For a while, the premier's office didn't have any women in it. And during the time I was doing interviews, there was one woman in it who was involved, but also junior in relation to like, you know, a lot of like senior men. And, you know, like Erin's absolutely right that this like primarily benefits, like I would say, like it's the most advantaged like women who were the beneficiaries of affirmative gatekeeping. Like it, and I mean, this is true not just in New Brunswick, but like in federal politics as well. Like you don't see, like when I was in New Brunswick anyway, like I saw that the Liberals nominated like no Indigenous candidates, no racial, or one racialized candidate and both of those you would expect, like based off of population, there to be about 2 on like the slate. And nominated like no out LGBTQ candidates, like no like candidates who had disclosed having a disability. And so like this is, and like in class terms, like these were generally people who were like professionals or managers. It's like you go to like the Chamber of Commerce or, you know, like find someone who's involved in a prominent community organization. And like these are usually, yeah, it's a very like this type of group is definitely not representative of like all women. It's like generally the same kind of people you saw in politics when it was like dominated by men. It's just like you're finding women who look similar to them.
Thank you, Quinn. And I want to press on that notion a little bit more. Like, you know, we hear things like, you know, recruitment of women is going on, and at baseline, this sounds like a good beginning. But to your point, you know, where is the recruitment happening? Is it happening within, you know, own personal networks? How are these processes operating? You know, how is the Premier's office involved? And, you know, like, can you shed some light a little bit on what that kind of recruitment, I mean, looks like and means?
Yeah, so I mean, some of it is like in this particular case, like some of what ended up happening was that the like the Premier's office sort of started with like people they already like knew, like often people who'd been involved in the party or like had some connections, and like tried to get them to run first. And often they went through the nominations process earlier, like, and went through uncontested. And then it was like, you know, we don't necessarily know someone. So reaching out through networks. During like the 2018 New Brunswick election, there was an advocacy organization called Women for 50%, who was, like this organization was like pushing for gender parity in politics. And like part of how they tried to find people was talking to Women for 50%, which they thought was a like sympathetic organization.
Right.
And like some of it was just having like someone, like one person in the Premier's office, like going around and trying to make sure that there was a woman running where they wanted women to be running.
You know, I think, I'm sorry, please finish your sentence.
It was just like having like spending extra time trying to find women candidates was part of like making this work.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to your point, I think good intentions are very important, but obviously stepping outside of our own lived experience, outside of our own networks, and really consciously building and recruiting is an important piece. So Erin, this is where I'd love to draw you back in. And, you know, the Democratic Engagement Exchange is a community, a place for community democracy. And so that's what I want to ask a little bit about, you know, the role of advocacy organizations, associations, and community, and really helping to develop talent pipelines that are truly diverse. So I really would love to hear about the work that you've been doing with Operation Black Vote Canada, who are very good friends of the exchange.
Yes, I know you know them, and that you've had Velma Morgan, who
we did,
who's the executive director of the organization. I mean, the work that Operation Black Vote Canada does is really crucial to encouraging candidates to run, offering training and support for them. One of the things I found in my own work on candidate recruitment is often, you know, these so-called more diverse candidates, so these non-prototypical candidates, they often come from outside of political circles. profiles purposefully. I mean, parties can't find them within their insider networks, and so they have to look elsewhere. And I think this is really positive. It brings different life experiences into politics, but it also often leaves the people who are recruited feeling kind of unprepared for this new political environment that they are in. Many of the people that are recruited have, been very actively involved in NGO organizing, in political organizations that are external to partisan politics. So they are definitely political people, but not in that party politics way. And the party politics environment is, is often inhospitable. It can be hostile. It can be confusing, and sometimes candidates that come from outside feel unprepared for that environment, and frankly, they are sometimes not welcomed. They are it's kind of counterintuitive because they are recruited in part for their difference, but then they're expected to conform. And this often results in a big tension for these candidates that are recruited. So organizations like Operation Black Vote Canada, which not only encourage more diverse candidacies, but also provide support and information and training, that's really crucial, as well as a community of sort of mentorship between Black candidates who have ran and served in office before, and those who are coming up. And partly these organizations exist because parties haven't filled this role. Parties, have made commitments to more diverse candidacies, but for the most part, local party presidents remain predominantly white, predominantly male. Very few Canadians are members of political parties, roughly 2 to 5%, and most of those also are not reflective of the broader society. So on the one hand, groups like Operation Black Vote Canada or Equal Voice, these play a sort of positive role, but to me, they're also somewhat a sign of institutional failure. Like, it shows that parties haven't succeeded, and that's why these groups exist.
I think that's a very interesting point because, ultimately we might have diversity, but if you don't have inclusion, then is the work really being done? Because, we actually had, as you may know, we had Selena Chauvin on a few months ago, who really helped us deep dive into that very tension. And so, are these political parties also kind of coming to the, well, I think we know that in many cases they're not, but how can they start to come to the table in terms of doing the work of both D and I? Quinn, did you want to take that one?
Well, I think it's a good question. I haven't seen especially great models of like parties following through on like, I think in many cases, like, parties just don't think about it. It's about getting like a slot on a candidate slate, or like filling their, contributing to their percentage that they can give to news organizations or advocacy organizations to show how committed they are to diversity. But yeah, in many cases, like, they aren't thinking about like what they need to do for inclusion until after people are already there. And sometimes it causes some conflicts. Like, if you think about like things like if you're going to like have like young mothers, for example, as candidates, which is something that like many parties like to show that they're, trying to be inclusive of women, and not just women who like have like, children who are already adults, or, women who are traditionally candidates in Canada, but like also like, women who like may also have like, childcare responsibilities or things like that. But then they don't like go into like trying to provide like daycare at the Legislative Assembly, or they have rules that prevent like breastfeeding in, it's or like don't even allow children onto the floor of like an assembly. Like these types of things are.
It's a central tension, right, Quinn? You know, we have these historical structures that exist with many, many years of traditions and processes and rules. And yet we're living in a society in 2022 where these rules just don't adhere. There is no one side, like a huge part. I mean, the central piece of equity, diversity, inclusion is that there is no one size fits all. That, you know, we're, as we were talking about in our briefing call, you know, we're living, breathing, evolving individuals with needs. We come from different perspectives, lived experience, lineages, and, you know, all of these kind of protocols and rules are just simply at heart not equitable, which you've been sharing. So I guess I think it's one of the struggles here is all this end goal thinking, right? To just kind of get these candidates on the ballot to just, you know, kind of have these end results. So Erin, I wanted to just press on that a little bit more and talk about the end game of winning a bit. So winning can often be viewed as the ultimate goal here. So how does that goal of representation and diversity and inclusion and all the things we've been talking about lie in tension with the ultimate value of winning?
So yes, for parties, winning is the goal. That is the goal. That is why they exist. I mean, of course, they have some sort of policy objectives, and you know, perhaps even in losing, they're able to give space to those. But ultimately, they want to win. I have heard this perspective that, you know, if you focus on representation, this could conflict with the goal of winning. I mean, I reject that premise out of hand. It to me kind of sounds like this standard debate that if you you know, consider diversity in cabinet appointment processes, then you are missing out on the most meritorious potential ministers. And the reason I reject that is because having more diversity or having a more representative candidate slate is exactly consistent with the goal of winning. That there are a lot of disenchanted and disaffected voters who do not see themselves reflected in partisan politics, reflected in the legislatures. And if parties, you know, took steps to make their membership more inclusive, not just more diverse, but more inclusive, they would see payoff in this respect if they put forward candidate slates that reflect the life experiences of Canadians, particularly those who are opting right now not to vote. There is a payoff to that. You know, nearly all of the research that looks at voter bias in Canada confirms again and again that although yes, there are racist and sexist people in Canada, when they show up at the ballot box to vote in partisan electoral contests, for the most part, their partisan identification or their preferred party label overrides whatever sexism or racism they might have. And this is why we say again and again that if women or Indigenous people or racialized candidates run, they can win. There is little evidence that voters are systematically biased against them. They are happy to vote for those candidates when those candidates are running for their preferred political party. So there's really no tension here. There is nothing lost. And much to be gained from looking for more diverse candidates, from taking steps to make party structures more inclusive. The only thing that is really stopping parties, I think, is one, an unknowingness about how to do that, which relates partly to who is involved, and also a bit of fear. Because there is also evidence that party elites regularly underestimate the ability of women and racialized candidates to win. So, you know, even though I am telling you, I'm saying there is not a problem with voter bias, party elites do not believe that. They think that there is a potential risk in nominating women in certain ridings, or nominating racialized or Indigenous candidates in particular contexts, or feeling that you can only run an Indigenous candidate in Northern Canada, or you know, a few urban centers. And that's really, you know, these are kind of deeply held assumptions by party elites that have been difficult to shake.
Thank you, Erin. I feel like that was certainly an aha moment for me. I didn't know that. So thank you for teaching us. And, you know, fear is fear of the unknown, conscious and unconscious biases. These are a lot of the reasons why I think we're not making progress and inroads as much as we should. But then I also think, you know, once candidates are in these positions, and we've talked about this before here at the exchange, there's also fear of getting into politics itself, I think, from the candidate side as well. You know, so Quinn, I want to ask you, what about creating safe spaces for candidates as them actually being willing to run in politics? We see more and more that racialized people and, you know, people who have experienced barriers traditionally are not safe in political spaces. They experience disproportionate amount of online hate and vitriol. They're not properly, I think both of you mentioned before, they're not properly protected or equipped or really briefed on how tough things are actually going to be. So I guess my question, Quinn, is, you know, how can we start to create safer spaces and equip these candidates so that they actually want to be representing Canada, you know, in these halls?
Yeah, I think this is a tricky issue because I don't know. I mean, I think there are larger issues outside of parties, particularly with regard to like issues of like harassment, that we need to find ways to address like as a country as a whole. I would say that like one thing parties could do that I haven't always heard of happening would be to like make sure that people have like mentors or like people who have had similar experiences, if they exist, talk about how they handled it. To me, this is kind of a band-aid because like just being prepared for harassment is not going to fix the problem. Like this can motivate people not to run or to leave politics. But like, you know, fostering like spaces for like members of different marginalized groups to talk amongst themselves over how to respond to the harassment they face is maybe one way to like start to deal with it. But I think this is an area where like I don't know what the right answer to stopping like the kind of harassment the candidates face is yet.
I think that's okay. I you know, it's all something that we're all working on and grappling with because it's happening in real time. And you know, I appreciate you tentatively answering it. So I wanted to ask you both one more question, and we have a few that have come in from the audience. So I want to make time for those as well. But you know, for our audience here, what can the electorate do to hold parties accountable for creating and producing a greater diversity of candidates? Erin?
One of the big things from my perspective is just keeping the pressure on about who is being nominated. You know, in a recent Quebec provincial election, the number of women candidates increased a lot, and researchers there really attribute that to the media, and especially feminist columnists kind of putting the party's feet to the fire and saying, you know, where are all the women? Why aren't you nominating more? Certainly, you know, the media have done an increasing number of stories on candidate diversity during elections. It used to be that they only looked at gender, but increasingly are looking at other identities. And I think that's really had an impact on the diversity of candidate slates, particularly for racialized and Indigenous peoples. In the most recent federal election, there were big upticks in the proportion of candidates coming from those groups. And I think that in part, you know, is a response to this pressure. You know, as I said, parties want to win. And if they feel that not having a reflective caucus or not having a reflective candidate slate is going to interfere with their chances of winning, they're going to do it. And so putting pressure on them. I think the other thing, you know, not all of us run for office, but we can be supporters and allies. A big thing that we haven't talked about is fundraising. And so one part of my research with Randy Besco and Samara looks at fundraising and donations to candidates. That research finds that women candidates are more likely to receive donations from women. Wonderful. but that women in general are much less likely to donate. So the constituency that women candidates are most likely to get their financial capital, the kind of juice for the campaign, is the least likely to give to them. And so, you know, thinking about fundraising and donor networks, I think that's a really important piece as well, that, you know, even if you don't want to run, you can support a candidate through money, through organizing, through campaigning.
Thank you. And I think to your point, you know, about the media, one of the amazing things about social media, we were just discussing the downside, is that we're all broadcasters now. So you're right, we can call for it, we can tweet about it, we can be actually quite loud from our own personal like home spaces and offices. So, you know, I think your point about speaking up and kind of putting our money where our mouth is two good calls to action. Quinn, did you want to weigh in there as well? And then we'll take the audience questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
I think I would say, so I agree very much with the idea that you just need to keep pressure on parties, and that they will act if they believe it's in their like electoral interest to produce more diverse candidate slates. But I want to emphasize that we're not going to change parties just by focusing on them during elections or like the immediate run up to elections. Like, we need to be paying attention to this well in advance. Like the people who are recruiting candidates inside political parties are starting this, you know, 2 years, if not more, before the next election. And so like, we should be focusing on it then, not just when an election's coming up. And I think that's something that, like, you know, journalists, like academics should be paying attention to, and advocacy organizations as well.
You know, this is a big part of the work we do here. It's really driving home the point that democracy is an everyday thing. It's not just an election cycle thing. And so, you know, that's a huge takeaway as well. We have a couple of great questions coming from our audience, one that I think we could do an entire episode on. But this is coming in from Sam. So could you speak to the situations where voters seem to vote against their own interests? It's a hard question. For example, Churchill, Kiowa, Chinook, ASCII has a predominantly Indigenous population, but keeps electing white people. And this is not the case there. I think this is a gigantic problem in democracy and electoral politics. Erin, did you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting case study. I don't know the specifics of you know, all of what's going on there, but there is an example at the municipal level that I'm more familiar with, which is the case of Mississauga, which has a predominantly racialized population and has throughout its history elected all white councils. It's only very recently that they elected a racialized councillor who had previously been a provincial legislature. A couple of sort of explanations that we come up on there. One is the incumbency advantage, and I think this plays out in the example that you're talking about in Manitoba. Is you know, it's not impossible, it is more difficult to unseat an incumbent, and so you know, because the incumbent in that riding has continued to reoffer, it's hard for a newcomer to defeat them. The other thing is a big question about voter turnout. So who shows up to vote? So even in you know, the example of Mississauga that I'm more familiar with, at the municipal level, voter turnout among racialized voters is very, very low. And this is not to say that racialized voters only wish to see racialized representatives, but that is one of the barriers that racialized candidates face, sort of similar to the case of donations, that racialized voters are more likely to support racialized candidates, but if they're less likely to turn out to vote, then that sort of constituency, that potential basis for support dissipates. And we know that voter turnout among Indigenous peoples is low, or lower than other Canadians. And often there are systemic reasons for that,
Absolutely.
We don't make voting easy all the time, or and so that's a really big thing to think about as well, is voter turnout. I think that could be part of it.
And there's a multitude of barriers as well, just systemically, that I think contribute to that as well. Our next question is actually from one of our own, from Ashley. So I'm going to let Ashley pose that. And Ashley, can you unmute and go for it?
Hi,
Thank you.
Quinn and Erin. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the practice of parachute candidates, and if there is any evidence that this practice is increasing as centralized party power increases, and maybe if there's any examples of the practice backfiring on the party in question.
Quinn, did
Sure.
you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm
Thank you.
happy to do that. I mean, I think parachuting can be used in different ways. Like the way I would usually think of parachuting is running a candidate in a riding other than where they live. But like some people would use this to refer to, for example, like a party leader directly appointing a candidate, which is possible in some parties, particularly federal and provincial liberal parties. I mean, there is, I would say if you take a long historical view of this, it has been increasing over time. Or it has increased from where it was in, like, say, the 70s, for example. But like a lot of what happens, or a lot of how like party leaders, their staff, party headquarters, and other like sort of central actors are influencing the process isn't necessarily through parachuting. It may be from someone who's like local to the riding and may not obviously be like their preferred candidate.
Thank you, Quinn. I feel like, I could very easily spend another hour with both of you, really just kind of picking your brains on this very deep topic. But I'm actually going to say thank you so much for the conversation we had. I feel like everybody learned a lot, and there's some really important calls to action there of where to go next. So really appreciate the time. I'm actually going to hand the microphone, so to speak, over to John Beebe, who has a couple important announcements about some upcoming work from the exchange. So hi, John.
Hi, thank you very much. And thank you very much for that conversation. As someone who's newish to Canada, I still find the nomination process incredibly opaque. And I think it's really critical for us to understand how our leaders are chosen. And this is clearly such a critical and understood part of it. And so I really appreciate you both, your insights there. And also, Erin, I appreciate your point. Perfect transition to what I have to offer today about voter turnout, because ultimately there's a nomination process and many more people could have a huge impact on our leadership and who is chosen if they just got involved in the nomination process. I think we could use some reform, but let's just start by getting involved. But then, of course, once somebody makes it through the nomination process and then actually runs, who's turning out to show up and participate. And we know that one of the greatest barriers people face to participation is knowledge and interest in politics. And the way we build interest is we build it in community and we ask people to get involved. And if we just leave it to the political parties, we know who they're going to ask. So that's why we're doing a lot to try to bring in new voices through that piece. So I would encourage everybody, to check out resources that we've just launched for the upcoming Ontario election, including a handbook that is designed for first-time and infrequent voters. So if you or someone you know is involved in a community organization or a student organization that has access or is involved with a lot of newcomers, this handbook is really like inspiring and empowering, and has all the basic information. So we'll post a link to that. Ashley's posted a link to our resources there. And then next week, another event, which isn't just about elections, but I'm super excited about, is for a a film screening we're doing with Hot Docs, which is about some incredible community leaders. And it's a series of documentaries, and we've created a toolkit for that. So if you're interested in getting a little inspired by some of the leaders who are making it, they do actually feature one of my favorite politicians who has made it through all the gatekeeping, despite, or maybe because of her greatness. But Jill Andrews is one of the MPPs and who will be featured, and Jill will be there for the screening next week. and it's just really fun and a little powerful, not to, material that we'll be sharing. So hope folks can make it to that. But again, thanks everybody for joining us here today. These are the kind of conversations that I think we need to have in order to figure out how here in Canada we can make sure we have a strong and vibrant and diverse and inclusive democracy. Because we're certainly seeing the challenges around the world as it relates to all those issues. And so it's not something we can take for granted. So I appreciate everybody's work here and everybody who's here with us today. Thanks so much.